Okay, good evening, everyone. Many thanks for joining us for this event, which will be based on the future of our civil liberties. To begin with, I'd like to inform everyone once again that we're recording today's event. So this is part 3 of a 4-part webinar series called Justice Means Everyone, a collaboration between Abolitionist Futures and Pluto Press. You can see the first session on abolishing surveillance and the second on the criminalization of solidarity on the Abolitionist Futures website or YouTube channel. So the series is spanning 4 webinars, addressing issues around policing and resistance in the broad sense, and touching on issues that have sometimes been compartmentalized into these discussions, such as counterterrorism, national security, the inadequacies of the rights framework, and the erosion of our civil liberties. Today, we'll be discussing the future of our campaigning on civil liberties, thinking about the decades-long project to erode them, and moving forward to how we build the movement to resist the attacks that we see. From the recently announced investigation into progressive extremism to multiple securitized lockdowns, there seems to be no light on the horizon for mobilizing on our civil liberties. This project has spanned multiple decades under different political parties. Free speech, free assembly, and association have been long fought for by the left and by society as principles that we defend as a means to hold power to account. As such, they are indivisible from related freedoms, such as the freedom to organize for the betterment of society's material conditions. When we defend these rights, we do not do so merely in the name of abstract principles, but as a means to advance popular democracy, empower workers, and challenge state power. The direction of travel of repressive laws is increasingly moving from targeting activists to NGOs and now lawyers and the judiciary. While we are defending the defenders, we must not neglect the job of advancing the vision of a more democratic society at large. All of this is, of course, happening in the context of an unprecedented pandemic, which has seen new legislation with little scrutiny being rushed through both houses. The government had chosen fairly early on that its response to the pandemic was not going to be a public health one, but one based on carceral logics. And the results are clear to see. The equivalent of more than a quarter of all Black 15 to 24-year-olds in London were stopped and searched in the first lockdown. Protests targeted over the summer with upcoming legislation to make it illegal to protest in places like Parliament Square. And the vaccine apartheid has morphed into the creation of a clearly racist designation of hotspot zones announced by the government yesterday. I saw just before we started this webinar that Dalia Gabriel had tweeted that Botswana, which had 0 new cases today, is on the red zone list, meaning if people come from there and don't quarantine in a hotel costing £2,000, they could face 10 years in jail. But if you come from the United States, which has 96,460 new cases today, you will not face those cautions. Amidst all of this, the scale of the challenge cannot be lost. This webinar will assess the terrain on which we find ourselves and offer ideas on how we move ahead. And to do that, we are joined by 3 phenomenal speakers. So the first that will be speaking is Sam. So Sam is the head of policy and campaigns at Liberty and has worked there for 3 years on a broad range of human rights issues, from migrants' rights, Gypsy, Roma, and traveller rights, mental health and disability rights, and human rights frameworks. Before that, Sam worked for Renee Kassim, the Jewish Voice for Human Rights, and before that in youth work. Also joining us is Eda Seyhan. Eda is a international human rights lawyer and researcher focused on policing, national security, and racial justice. She has worked for Amnesty International, Open Society Foundation, and ActionAid International, amongst other organizations. Her work has included writing a leading guide to investigating racial profiling, researching human rights abuses in Turkey and Western Europe, and running a successful campaign to free a Syrian man unfairly convicted on terrorism charges. She is a qualified solicitor in England and Wales and a member of the Haldane Society and the Institute of Post-Colonial Studies. And the final speaker for today is Asad Rehman. Asad is the executive director of War on One. He is a lifelong campaigner against racial injustice and economic injustice and was the chair of Newer Monitoring Project, and has been involved in multiple campaigns of holding the state to account, such as the Justice for John Charles de Menendez campaign. Asad has been at the forefront of the climate justice movement, both in the UK and globally, helping to reframe climate as an issue of racialized capitalism, economic and social injustice. He is the co-convener of the Global Green New Deal project to connect the climate crisis, neoliberal inequality, COVID, and the historical exploitation of the global South. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Sam to deliver his opening remarks.
Thanks, Ilyas. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's great to be on the panel. Thank you to Abolitionist Futures, Pluto Press for organising tonight and the whole webinar series. The future of civil liberties is a big discussion topic. I'll do my best to do justice by it. I want to approach it by thinking about what's happened in response to the pandemic, specifically in the UK, then a brief diversion about where that approach is situated in the broader political context, and finish by thinking about some of the threats and opportunities ahead. It's become passé to say that the pandemic has seen the greatest incursion on our civil liberties in generations, but the huge powers that were vested in the government and into the police through the Coronavirus Act, passed last March in a day with very little scrutiny, shouldn't be accepted as the only route that could have been taken, and indeed shouldn't be accepted as the only route that we can continue along. The government's response since the outset has been one that has been focused on criminal justice over protecting public health, on punishing rather than supporting people to follow the guidance, on maintaining the status of the hostile environment rather than protecting us all, and on limiting protest rights rather than ensuring we can stand up for what we believe in. We know the impact of this approach falls disproportionately on those already marginalised and on those already over-policed and over-surveilled. And you didn't have to be a clairvoyant to predict what our investigations team found when they revealed that police forces in England and Wales were up to 7 times more likely to find BAME people in lockdown, or JCWI's recent report, which shows that 43% of all migrants are afraid to seek healthcare because of data sharing and the hostile environment, or the impact of allowing councils to cut social care meant that 7 in 10 people with a learning disability reported having their social care cut during the first lockdown. It was sadly, for the most part, predictable. When Liberty were campaigning last September to scrap the Coronavirus Act, one response that we got from MPs was that there was no alternative legislation in place, that they wouldn't vote against the bill or get rid of it because then we'd be left with nothing. Despite the fact that if they'd done that, they would have 21 days to come up with something new. But we also saw that it was predominantly backbench Conservatives outflanking many in the Labour Party, and certainly the front bench of the Labour Party, when raising civil liberty concerns. Ahead of the next opportunity to reset this broad direction, that act is going to be reviewed again in March. Liberty put together a new rights-respecting bill to counter that argument that there's no alternative, that gets rid of the most concerning parts of the bill, but also, importantly, provides the support needed for everyone to comply with public health guidance. So we've consulted with charities, NGOs across housing, education, migrants' rights, data protection, employment, public health, prisons, to really pull this document together. And it moves us, hopefully, from what was an important campaign which focused on scrapping a dangerous piece of legislation to being able to campaign on a positive vision of what the world could be, that shows there is an alternative, another way is possible, and that would be based on support rather than punishment. Do follow us on social and so on to help support that campaign when we launch it towards the end of this month. But we also know that this pandemic as a whole has served as an X-ray, as an exacerbator onto the cracks that already existed in society. It's not the cause of them. The pandemic invites us to ask more fundamental questions about what exactly healthy, safe and flourishing communities look like, both right now and in the future. The hostile environment, creaking social care system, discriminatory tech and policing all existed way before the pandemic came into being. And the trend of an authoritarian executive power grab was in train long before the pandemic came along as well. And it's here where, if I can, I'll touch briefly on some of the wider context that I think is important. So clearly, this is a government that is allergic to and hostile to scrutiny, and it's intent on eroding democratic accountability. And there are multiple pieces to this puzzle. The Conservative Election Manifesto contained plans to launch the grandly titled Constitution, Democracy and Rights Commission. Those plans were quietly shelved last summer, but although that approach was discarded, the work and thought process behind it certainly wasn't. Without the Grand Commission, it's hard to find neat hooks to talk about how this all connects. But when you put this all on one piece of paper, it certainly amounts to a dramatic assault that we should really be concerned by. So in terms of legislation, it's important to see how the Overseas Operations Bill, the CHIS Bill, the Spycops Bill, the Internal Markets Bill, as well as a bill shortly coming from the Home Office called the Sovereign Borders Bill, all fit together. These bills are slowly chipping away at human rights, without that sometimes even being the main focus of those pieces of legislation, often wrapped in culture war issues that eats away at the potential coalition that could work to prevent these bills. So you've got the Overseas Operations Bill, which limits the application of human rights and creates a de facto amnesty for soldiers who commit torture. You've got the CHIS Bill, which ostensibly does the same for undercover agents. You've got the Internal Markets Bill, which attempted to remove the duty of government ministers under the Human Rights Act to act compatibly with our rights when making regulations. And the upcoming Sovereign Borders Bill, which aims to severely restrict judges' ability to interpret the law when broadly coming to human rights claims, and also change the definition of inhuman and degrading treatment, which is going to have a massive impact on immigration and migrants' rights. Tied to this are ongoing and supposed independent reviews of how the Human Rights Act works and how judicial review works. We also have ongoing briefing usually via the Telegraph, that will be facing a bill this year that seeks to further create barriers to protest. So none of this is neutral, even if it's wrapped up in language of independent reviews and so on. So all of which needs to be understood next to this trend of centralisation of power, executive centralisation of power. We could see this clearly in the government's COVID response, and it's certainly one of the issues that has exercised a lot of parliamentarians since the crisis started. So last time we counted, the government had laid 285 coronavirus-related statutory instruments before Parliament, so essentially law, but over 95% of which of these instruments were made law before Parliament even had an opportunity to debate them. And that lack of scrutiny and transparency is particularly concerning when establishing a raft of police powers and criminal justice measures. The increasing use of delegated powers was proliferating before COVID, of course, and was a regular feature of Brexit legislation as well. But you put all this next to reform of the Supreme Court, reform of how judges are selected, attacks on the Freedom of Information Act, the Electoral Commission, the list could go on. They all point to a desire to centralise power, increase state power, and avoid accountability, which will have implications way beyond the lifespan of this government. So we have that kind of attack on three fronts: sidelining a parliament, attacks on our ability to gain justice via the court, and attacks on our right to protest in the streets. All of this needs to be organised against and called out for what it is. And as I said, whilst these might seem like technical changes in a range of different places, cumulatively, they are profoundly dangerous and an ideological attack on our civil liberties and human rights. And we all know who will most benefit and lose out from the mass concentration of state power and the decimation of the ways in which we can stand up to it. So drawing to a close, bringing this back to the pandemic and the future of civil liberties. I'm not going to lie, that this government with its agenda and with its 80-seat majority has the ability to rip up what protections do exist and make life harder for those already oppressed. But we can only push back together, supporting the institutions and organizations we respect, building broad coalitions based on solidarity. And we need to build on narratives that connect migrant justice to housing justice to disability justice. And in the kind of words of the framing of this entire webinar series, justice means everyone. Crises are always times when rights can be pushed aside, we know that, and we must be hyper-vigilant to those Trojan horses, particularly on tech solutionism, on slippery slopes to ID cards, of discriminatory tech dressed up as quick and easy routes back to normality. Because ultimately normality can't be what we're aiming for, and we have to aim higher than that. We've got to aim for a society in which people aren't afraid to seek the support they need, and one hopefully in which they're less likely to need to seek that support in the first place as well. I look forward to hearing from the other panelists, but I hope that's a good start.
It absolutely is. Thank you very much, Sam. So now we will come to Eda.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Before I begin, I want to thank Abolitionist Futures and Pluto Press for putting together this series of events. And thanks, Sam, for that great start. I want to start by asking everyone to think back to the 2017 and 2019 general elections. Painful memories, I'm sure, for many of us. During both those elections, Labor ran on a promise of delivering more police officers. The 2019 manifesto, which was, very radical in lots of ways, didn't promise to repeal Prevent, nor did it promise to repeal the many other powers that Tories have kind of gathered for themselves in various fits of national security policy making over the last 10 years. So I want to kind of start my sort of segment by kind of asking why that movement that was so willing to push the boat on issues of the economy, the environment, was so unwilling and lacking courage in terms of bringing radical ideas into the mainstream on policing, national security, and civil liberties actually more broadly. I think there are lots of reasons for that. There's obviously Labor's long and shameful history of being tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. There's also the fact, you could point to the fact that socialism perhaps is not as averse to the exercise of state power as other ideologies of the left. But what I kind of want to focus on is an aspect that I think is at least part of the reason for this, and that's that the terrain of civil liberties in the UK has been kind of dominated by liberal voices and liberal approaches, mostly in the mainstream media, also kind of in civil society. And generally the way that we talk about civil liberties and state power is almost exclusively in terms of human rights and the rule of law. And that's the kind of language that we saw reproduced in that 2019 Labour manifesto. Now, that obviously there's Tory attacks on human rights. So to sort of say maybe the human rights approach is not the best approach might seem a bit obtuse, but I just want to explain exactly what I mean by that. So the liberal approach to civil liberties, I think is something that we need to push back on, mostly because it permits states to restrict our rights and freedoms in the name of security, public order, the prevention of crime, public health, of course. And using those vaguely defined pretexts, states can mask a whole lot of repression and coercion. Generally, the liberal framework only dictates the bare minimum of what states can't do. It doesn't propose a kind of fully developed conception of what a good society looks like. So when we apply a narrow human rights framework to state power, we often end up taking for granted that those powers should exist, and then demanding minimal reforms like stronger checks or more oversight or more training, essentially tinkering around the edges rather than really questioning or suggesting having a fuller debate on what the proper function and scope of the police or security services are, what the nature of security or safety means, and how we want to be governed more broadly. So in view of that those kind of limitations of the liberal approach and its sort of minimal demands, I want to talk about two kind of alternative ways of talking about civil liberties. The first, and this kind of comes back to what Sam was saying about finding a narrative that links migrant justice, environmental justice, and our civil liberties, etc. The first is to kind of make clearer the links between neoliberalism and state repression and control. So neoliberalism is often mistakenly kind of understood as a reduction in the size of the state, but that's only half of the story. We've seen a reduction or shrinking of the welfare state as the carceral state has expanded. When kind of economic and social policies move away from universal welfare and inclusion, they obviously create more people who live at the margins, more people deemed undesirable, risky, non-compliant, dangerous in various ways, and therefore subject to exclusion, imprisonment, surveillance, and so on. So that causative link between neoliberalism and punitiveness, which has also been, empirically documented and proven by criminologists for a long time, I think that's something that we need to focus more on, rather than kind of a narrow look at civil liberties as divorced from these other structures of power. So that's kind of a call to really focus on not just the kind of privatization, austerity, and other kind of economic and welfare issues that we've got really good, I think, at criticizing in terms of neoliberalism in the past few years, but also to focus on that other side of the equation, which is, that intensely kind of interventionist and authoritarian approach to those who are left behind by what is an increasingly unforgiving economy. So that's kind of one alternative way of talking about these issues. The other, obviously, is an abolitionist framework. And I want to come to what Sam was talking about with COVID as well, and discuss maybe what that kind of abolitionist framework prompts us to think about. And it's some of the same issues that Sam brought up. So since the start of the pandemic, at least 92 countries all over the world have declared states of emergency. Now that means giving the executive a huge amount of power, which they've used to obviously impose quarantines, lockdowns, curfews, expand surveillance, bypass normal procurement processes, and so on. So I had worked previously on states of emergency in Turkey and France, and sort of drawing on that experience with another comrade of mine, set up a monitoring project to kind of monitor and visualize and document abuses of police power and emergency powers during the pandemic. So in that kind of monitoring work, we encountered cases of police overreach and violence pretty much all over the world. As consistent as the spread of the virus has been, so too has been this pandemic. I hate using that as a metaphor, but this pandemic of police violence and kind of overreach that it's unleashed. And that's not a surprise when you look at the history of pandemics, which have always reinforced existing patterns of discrimination. There's always certain populations, certain people within the population who are deemed deserving of the protection of the state, while others are deemed risky, unfairly blamed for spreading the virus, and in some cases more tightly controlled as a result. So we saw that, of course, in the examples that Ilyas gave at the start in the UK, in London. We also saw that in Eastern Europe towards Roma settlements, in India, where Muslims were disproportionately policed under COVID-19 regulations, in South Africa, where it was low-income neighborhoods and townships that bore the brunt of COVID-19 related police brutality, in France, where an immigrant and mostly working class suburb of Paris had breaches of lockdown rules policed at 3 times the rate of the rest of the country. As ever, of course, with these kind of emergency regimes, there's a fear that states will cling on to emergency powers after the end of the crisis. And that's indeed what I saw in France and in Turkey. And so that's kind of a persistent danger with these sort of apparently short-term crises. But I want to come back to that. So something Sam mentioned as to kind of the backbench conservatives being a bit more attuned to civil liberties risks than others. And obviously there is a danger of conflating abolitionist approaches to the pandemic with anti-lockdown, sort of the anti-lockdown movement. And obviously we've seen a lot of anti-lockdown protests emerging from the kind of broader COVID-19 conspiracy movement. And I just want to kind of make clear what the distinction is. And from my perspective, that is that those COVID-19 kind of anti-lockdown protests have generally come from a position of self-interest, demanding haircuts, for example, or a kind of perverse survival of the fittest dogma. Whereas we protest the specific punitive, and carceral nature of the government response. And really that's out of care and solidarity for those most marginalized who we know are going to be the first in line when it comes to police enforcement. But that distinction hasn't always been easy to make. And we certainly have seen parts of the left be basically very pro-police during the pandemic. In terms of what a kind of abolitionist perspective would look like, it would mean advocating for obviously accessible healthcare, firstly. It would mean advocating for dissemination of public education and reliable messaging about the pandemic, which we also have not been getting really. It would mean a safety net that allows people to stay at home. So safe housing, rent cancellation, worker protections, adequate income support. It would mean massive investment in testing, tracing, and isolating, and not outsourcing that to a failed private company. And generally it would mean not blaming individuals for a virus that, for these kind of consequences of the pandemic, and rather giving people the an adequate system to stay at home. I kind of want to also say that this pandemic should be an opportunity to be pushing these kind of demands more generally. We've seen the failure of a criminalization approach, and we have seen pretty much whenever there's a new or existing issue or social harm, politicians reach for the criminalization wand and everything is criminalized. And that is based on this mistaken belief that criminalizing behavior stops it, when actually it just adds to the list of behaviors that warrant police intervention. So what I would really like to see, and I'm really happy that this webinar series is happening, is the pandemic used as an opportunity to really question the underlying logic of criminalization and the carceral responses to essentially a public health concern. So I'll leave it there, and thanks again, and looking forward to hearing from the others.
Thank you so much, Eda. There's a lot to think about that. I'm hoping we can tease more in the discussion and the following Q&A. So moving on to Asad Rehman.
Thank you, Ilyas, and thank you for Abolitionist Futures and Pluto Press, I think, for this whole series of webinars, because it's a really critical issue, and some really great contributions from Sam and Eda, so much that I agree, and particularly the way that Eda's set out some of those challenges. And I think it's really important because we're as somebody who's been involved in like movements from way back in the 80s, around race and policing, you look at this moment, and sometimes there's this tendency, I think, amongst left activists in the UK, particularly, to look at the US and to think about their frames and think, oh, let's see how it can be applied to the UK. And we've seen that particularly around policing, where, of course, there's a lot of similarities, but people have looked at there and said, oh, look at the defund police frame, for example, and whilst there is similarities, of course, in terms of the ratio of spending on policing and criminal issues versus social and community services, the reality is it's that our challenge is very, very different here. The ratio of people who are killed by the police in the US each and every year is on a very, very different scale to for example, the scale of deaths in custody. And of course, it's a huge tragedy, and I'm being involved in many, many deaths in custody campaigns. Absolutely, but there is a difference between what, as Kevin Blow from Netpol says, the low intensity warfare that we have compared to the militarized policing of Black communities and working class communities in terms of the US. And I say that because, of course, when we look at the challenges here, they're on so many different levels. And as Sam pointed out, sometimes it's very, very difficult to work out how you deal with an onslaught of the state, which is largely about picking off piece by piece in a very, very coordinated way, but it's very strategic across a number of different areas. And it speaks to, when many of us think about, the challenges we've got around Prevent or the gangs database or Stop and Search and now COVID, they're all seen as very, very sort of fragmented issues. The one lesson I do think we should take from the US, and a very important one for left futures, is, that the resistance to policing wasn't spontaneous, right? It's come because of long, hard, deep movement building and community organizing. And that, and that network of sort of vibrant, interconnected movements and organizations was really able to embed a narrative and a discourse around civil liberties in a way that the defund police, the fact that it's being echoed by quite mainstream organizations, is a really important lesson for us that it is possible for us to have a very progressive agenda on civil liberties or human rights, or a more broader frame around justice. So some of my thoughts are much more about, because so many people have talked about what's now, I thought maybe I'll talk about a little bit about where we've come from as well, and maybe there are some lessons to be learned in terms of that. I think both Sam and Eda talked so much about, the deterioration of the discourse. This now largely, this space is the language of lawyers, right? Where previously it was the language of movements, and that having that broader frame of justice, which has been displaced by this very liberal frame of civil liberties in a very, very narrow way, has largely made it, well, this is going to be for in the courtrooms, or it's going to be for inside the state, in government, in an advocacy. And we see that in how, the space in which we operate is fragmented. If you look at mainstream civil society, largely in the NGO sector, they've prioritized access. It's always been about, we're going to ameliorate the worst excesses of this through access to parliament, and it's going to be insider advocacy, and that's our theory of change. Or when faced with multiple assaults, it's each sector saying, well, we'll look at our fight in isolation. So the trade union movement looked at the trade union bill and said, how do we protect ourselves in that? But rather than connecting across broader and with other movements and other struggles. So everybody looks at each issue through their own lens. And of course, and there are real mistakes to be made and lessons to be learned about the mistakes that we made. I mean, if you think about the war on terror, for example, many of us argued at that point, there was a fundamental moment where some of us argued that simply framing the war on terror around a civil liberties frame, and also framing it only around this as an attack on the Muslim community, or somebody from the Muslim community, was in itself already narrowing our ability to be able to oppose, where many of us had built for a long time those interconnected alliances and radical Black frames that tried to connect issues in all of our communities. That wasn't done. And so everything became again about, well, it'll be about access to then the Blair government to ameliorate the worst excesses. And it didn't have an anchor. And of course, all that we saw and we've seen, of course, in the last decades, each fight, we may win some small element, but the terrain has shifted. Each time the new criminal justice bills come in, it moves the frame further and further, and we're largely always on a defensive fight and never on an offensive fight, because we're constantly trying to respond to that. And I think that goes back to that principle of the organizing practice, right? Of how do we constantly build alliances rather than simply see fights as being, we have a fight, now come and join our fight. That has never worked, right? It's always worked when you are in constant engagement with other movements, threading your struggle with their struggle, constantly building the network of relationships and connections between movements and organizations, so that when these attacks come, they're seen as an attack on all rather than an attack on a specific part of our communities and societies. So that argument of what I would always say, the importance of building a united front around a framework is really, really critical. And, you know, and so I wanted to give, I suppose, a couple of very, very quick examples. You know, I was rifling through some of my books and I was just remembering the sort of 1984 Kill the Bill campaign, right? Going way back now in terms of that police bill. But when I looked at that 1984 Kill the Bill campaign and then the 1994 Criminal Justice Bill, you know, which did solely because it targeted, went after squatters' rights, it criminalized raves, the party scene, it restricted the right to protest. But we managed to put 50,000 people on the streets consistently against that. And that question about how we build power, how you connected quite disparate parts of society in a common fight wasn't simply about civil liberties. It was about a much more active frame around justice and our rights and an understanding of the state. And I saw that really in operation around Macpherson, right? Because I recently, you know, a lot of people all reach to this Macpherson, you know, inquiry and the Macpherson principle, and you know, and sometimes it's obviously been used to undermine radical movements and even silence part of our struggle. And people saw that as like, see it as and talk about it as if it was an end goal. It was never an end goal. First of all, you know, the movements that led to the Macpherson inquiry, we always had a much more radical vision around public order policing, around the role of the state and violence. And we saw the fight about calling for and identifying institutional racism as not as the end result, but as part of a longer part of struggle to constantly delegitimize the state and the violence it used and its intervention into our community. And so right from the beginning, when that Macpherson inquiry opened, the first thing we did, we challenged Macpherson. We said we want Macpherson to be sacked, that he was not the legitimate person. And we changed the balance of how that inquiry was taking place. No longer was it a legal inquiry, actually it became a political inquiry. We packed the gallery each and every day. And I know lots of people probably seen the pictures of when the murderers attend and there's this huge protest outside. Actually, we filled the gallery every single day of that inquiry by reaching out to different, like we said, today is student mobilization, today is trade union mobilization, and did a huge amount of outreach to bring people there, because we understood that the fight around this wasn't going to be won by the lawyers. Of course, the lawyers were important. It was going to be won by us changing the balance of power within the inquiry in itself. And those of you who got my age remember that the inquiry was deliberately put into Elephant and Castle. It was put into a nondescript building on whatever, the 13th floor. You know, it was all done to try and take it out of the public arena and make it a much more sort of, this will be a legal thing. It will come out with, you know, and so when that finding came about, you know, yes, the police were institutionally racist, that was not, in my thing, a victory of the inquiry. It was a victory of our people power, of organizing and how we changed the frame of the discourse and what we thought was acceptable. And everybody was shocked that Macpherson came out with that. And that, of course, was partly due to the fact that we changed the fact that it was Macpherson who was the panel to suddenly a cross-section of people to be on the panel about the Bishop of Stepney and Richard Stone, etc., and change the dynamics. So when, for example, the police came onto the witness stand, they came to howls of protest from the outside, to calls inside the court, inside the inquiry from communities around policing, and it just changed the nature. And we've always understood this. In every death in custody campaign, in every racist murder campaign, we've always understood the fight would never be won in the courts. In every self-defense campaign, it was never won in the courts. The courts were just a site of contestation for us. It was won by the movements that we were building on outside that were changing all of the discourse. And I think we've often let all of that go and then allowed it to become, as Eda said, you know, a very sort of liberal frame that you appeal to the state to act, you know, in the best interests of citizens, and you know, or appeal to backbench conservatives because they've got some view about individual liberty, etc. And we know that frame is is determined by who you are and where you are in society. And so whilst they may defend in broad principles, in reality, they're always willing to accept that criminalization. So I think we have to think about that balance. And I think there's some real challenges for us. I don't know, Ilyas, if I've got a couple more minutes. Sorry, I'm rambling on.
Yeah, you've got a few more minutes, Asad.
Okay, so, you know, and as Sam and Eda both identified, look, the terrain we're fighting on, about, for example, the right to protest, whether we're talking about, you know, the way that they're looking at trying to connect the criminalization of protests from XR to the far right, and what lessons we also learn from, for example, Stansted 15. And I know you had that this was won not simply because a bunch of activists went and did a direct action. It was won because actually there was a coalition of people built behind it that built the pressure to shift the terrain of what is acceptable direct action and what isn't acceptable. And I think that's really important, because often at this moment of real despair, a lot of our activists want to engage in some confrontation with the state, but without all of that other work that needs to be done behind it. There's some real questions for us as radical people. I mean, I don't know about other people, but I'm aghast at the fact that Twitter can take down the social media platforms of the right. I don't want them to take down that, because that was something we learned back in the First Time Racial Relations Act. We said these legislation, the first thing will happen will be used against us and our organizing. And we saw it with the racial relations. That first criminalization was Michael X. We've seen it now with, as Twitter takes down the right, it's also taking down the left. We saw it with Facebook. As it took down the right, it also took down the anti-fascist organizing. And that again comes back to this question of how we see no platform, right? So now we look to the state to enact no platform for us, where we had always said no platform was not something that we wanted the state to do. We would do by the power of our movements. We would shrink the space in which they occupied. We would take them on physically in the spaces they organize, but take them on ideologically in the communities that they organize. And I think too much of this liberal response is constantly looking again to the state as the arbiter and as the defender of our rights, without recognizing that the state is never neutral, right? The state comes within a neoliberal framework, as Eda quite rightly pointed out, comes with this frame. And whilst it may look like there are some small victories because we got rid of, you know, terrible people on social media spreading lies, it doesn't really benefit us. And Ed is absolutely right. When we look at how policing is being used against the anti-lockdown protesters, you know, if you look across Europe, though that same frame was used against anti-austerity protesters, right? And the more that the left sits by and says, it's all right for the state to do this because, you know, they're protecting our public health, because look at these mad anti-vaxxers and lockdown people. Again, I think we saw the seeds of legislation as that will be used against us. Now, Eda talked very brief about the big picture, and I think, again, we can see that, right? We're in a moment of multiple crises, and that crisis is going to get worse, whether we talk about from climate to inequality to the COVID pandemic. We see all these crises, and the frame of the response is a securitization and a militarized response. You look at, for example, the first reports in the US around climate change were done by the Pentagon. And the first things that they talked about was that we need an increase in border control because we'll have to stop migrant movement from Latin America and the Caribbean. And this was written 30 years ago. That's when they started to talk about predicting the things. You look at how the discourse around climate change is taking place in terms of forced displacement of people, and it's all about a securitization and a walls and fences. We saw that, of course, with Frontier X and the fact that, you know, things that we said would happen, that Europe would sit by while people drowned in the Mediterranean, and people said, Europe is a liberal democracy, it will never allow that. Now we see that exactly that happening. So I think there's a much more profound, bigger challenge for us, is that how do we recraft a new narrative around civil liberties? And that's why I really want to thank you for these webinars, because I think this is the kind of conversations that we used to have, and about how do we have a new vision, how do we build power to it, how do we embed it within our movement, and how do we actually challenge the state on the fights that are coming up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asad, and to all the panelists for their initial contributions. So for all the participants, if you have questions for either individual panelists or the panel as a whole, please put them in the chat box. There's a couple of questions just to guide the next part of the discussion, and then we'll move to audience Q&A as well. And really, I want to pick up around similar to to a point that a couple of people made. And this is around when we've built campaigns around civil liberties violations, which have boiled down to the finding of virtuous cases or wrongfully targeted people. So cases that can attract public sympathy, which often become depoliticized, individualized, and sometimes end up legitimizing unjust systems of state violence. So in Navarro media this week, a few members of the Stansted 15 wrote an article reflecting on their conviction and the subsequent trial and the media coverage and the way in which the campaign was run. And I just want to pull out one line from it, which was: a harmful idea propagated during the trial was that charging us with a terror-related offence was a misapplication of the law, or that applying it to us was somehow absurd. The implication being that there is a correct way to apply this law and a correct group of people to apply it to. We've seen this in the identifying of good and bad actors within different pieces of legislation. And I bring this up because we've seen this continue in political discourse all the way to this week, when we see sort of the identifying of BLM and XR as somehow these, progressive extremists with the both sidesing of political discourse. So Lord Walney, aka John Woodcock, as revealed in the Telegraph, as opposed to any sort of government press release, looks set to begin an investigation into extremism, and has identified progressive extremism as a site of concern. And I think Asad, you tweeted earlier this week that this has all the same veins as Trump's. There's fine people on both sides when he was talking about the aftermath of Charlottesville. And we know that we're going to see the state begin to continue equivocating the far right and those on the left that are pushing against the advances of the state and its move to crush dissent. So how do we respond to this investigation into progressive extremism? And also, how do we build campaigns in defense of civil liberties that avoid these trappings of good and bad people? So in terms of order, should we just go like the same order as the panel? So I'm not sure, Sam, if you want to go first.
Yeah, thanks. Great question, and really fascinating to hear from Asad and Eda as well. I think it's really important that we are aware of those traps that are easy to fall into. When we have to make sure that the work that we're doing and probably in good faith as well, isn't dialing in on those good actors, bad actors, and you see it across the board in terms of creating good migrants and bad migrants, or good protesters, bad protesters. These are really important things for us to interrogate when we're supporting and joining causes, in terms of the language you use, in terms of the interventions we make, both legal and non-legal interventions. And I think it's really important that we don't divorce singular cases that are taken from the broader context in which they sit, and that we always have a narrative storytelling responsibility to show where Stansted 15 fits in a broader attack on migrants and on protest, and we make sure that that's the story we're telling when we're talking about it. We're not going to get it right every time, but we have to have the humility to listen when people are telling us we've got it wrong. But I think it also comes a bit from what Asad was talking about, that those things are easier to guard against when you've done that hard work of creating that solidarity across lots of different movements, and you have those relationships and you can really understand the context across different issues that those things are sitting in. One thing particularly about this progressive extremism, John Woodcock kind of review, is that it is absolutely going to be used to then justify the protest bills that are coming down the line, which we know are already being framed as specifically as a response to Extinction Rebellion tactics. This is another example of we're doing this thing over here, and if we're not careful, and we aren't able to kind of respond collectively, we won't see how that connects to another thing down the line that is going to impact on everyone's right to protest. That is that's BLM, that's XR, that's anti-lockdown as well. That reduction in protest rights affects anyone who wants to stand up and make their voice heard. So it really is in some ways very obvious that that is the intention. It is going to be used to justify that the restrictions on protests that are coming down the line, and I think that needs to be called out from the off.
Thanks, Sam. Eda?
Thanks, Ilyas, for such a great question. I just on the progressive extremism stuff, I think there's two things that I want to say, and they're sort of competing. But the first is to make sure we don't lose sight of the fact that this is not at all new, right? Like, police have targeted anti-fascists and anti-capitalists under the rubric of countering terrorism for as long as the word terrorism has existed, right? So the Russian anarchists in the late 19th century were the first group to be called terrorists. Obviously, the war on terror has kind of shaped an understanding of it that makes us think that this was always a war on so-called Islamist groups. But for the vast expanse of kind of liberal democracy, the real terrorists have always been those who challenge capitalism. And so this is, a reinvention of a very old tradition. And I think it's really important to fiercely oppose it. I think it is extremely dangerous. So in my previous role, I worked on a case of a Spanish rapper who was prosecuted for glorifying terrorism for a song about hating cops and burning banks. So, there's the classification of things as terrorism unlocks this vast arsenal of authoritarian powers that are otherwise unavailable for normal criminal offenses. And some of those protections that exist under the law, which are themselves insufficient, but still the minimal protections that we have under the law are often stripped away as soon as someone is deemed a threat to national security or deemed a terrorist. So the state can deprive you of your citizenship on vague grounds of threats to national security without giving you the evidence, without giving you, judicial oversight and all those other kind of minimal but essential protections. So we need to kind of resist any attempts to classify any left groups as terrorist groups, and also kind of resist the broader framing of extremism, which expands terrorism out to, a much, much broader group of people who have no links to any acts of actual political violence. I think it's really important that we oppose it, and I think it's important that we recognize that it is a kind of entrenched issue. In terms of the ways to kind of talk about these things or oppose them, I think that what Asad said was really important in terms of not falling into the trap of thinking, great, now we have this extremism label, we should apply it to the far right. And I think abolition as a framework gives us a really useful way of thinking about these things. And an abolitionist demand would be to eliminate the category of terrorism altogether, to dismantle the global counterterrorism architecture that has ballooned since the war on terror. And that's not actually that hard to do. I think it's hard for some of us who were, for whom 9/11 was really a kind of formative event, to remember that, this like edifice of global counterterrorism architecture has been an outcome of the last 20 years in lots of ways. So to do that, to kind of an abolitionist demand to abolish the category of terrorism would be to assert that there is no real terrorist, that there are maybe mass murderers, there are war criminals, there are people who commit genocide, but the term terrorist is an essentially political and subjective one that functions just to portray certain opponents as irrationally violent, fanatics, and deflect attention away from the origin of their grievances, and to open up the possibility of a kind of us versus them dynamic, and foreclose any kind of compromise or to justify essentially repressive powers. So that's the kind of approach that I would like to see in response to the progressive extremism bill, rather than falling into the trap, as Asad said, of kind of taking that and thinking that we can use it to oppose the far right, when actually, you know, far right ideologies are reproduced by the Sun and the Prime Minister in a way that so-called Islamic ideologies are not. So, you know, we can't really say, let's just use this doctrine to oppose the far right, when we know that it's predominantly used to attack Muslim communities. So that's, that's what I would really like to see happen in opposition to the progressive extremism stuff.
Thanks, Eda. Asad?
So I agree. I think there's the broader question in terms of the use of the subjective word of terrorism and how it's applied, and it's being applied both in the UK and globally against basically political movements. And we've seen that, of course, how it's applied to the Palestinian people as a blanket against all civil society, human rights activists. We've seen it with Modi, how he's now applying it to the Indian farmers, and he previously applied it to minorities in the Muslim community in everywhere. So we know this global architecture exists. They all reinforce each other, and it's important for us to be challenging that. I think the question then, bringing it back down to how do we respond now to this sort of progressive extremism thing? I mean, I think the danger would be that we have a coalition that's been built on, as you quite rightly said, what are good protesters or good actors, and the good protesters or good actors are defined by what is acceptable within parameters of a simply like a very narrow civil liberties lens. I'm reminded of this debate, you know, back in the 90s. It was called the Spikies versus the Fluffies, whether it was legitimate, and it became this like a debate within progressive movements about the use of violence. And we always, as Black activists, used to turn it on its head and say, you know, the question about violence is not something that should be asked of us. The question is about state violence. When the state, how do we stop the state using violence against us? How do we stop racists using violence against us? Rather than should we have the right to use violence to defend ourselves, right? Because that it was trying to shift the terms of the debate. And I think it's important that now we try and shift the terms of that debate as well. So what we don't get is it's acceptable to do this kind of protest, that is acceptable, because a lot of things that will end up being criminalized are exactly the tools of people who are the most dispossessed in society. Blockades, occupations, sit-downs, these have all been tools that movements have used historically and continue to use, and they're all in danger of falling into the, you know, this is what ends up being criminalized. So what, you know, I think the good protester versus the bad protester is a really problematic frame. And so as we form coalition, I think we've got to really think about how do we defend the right to protest, not what is how they define who fits in as a protester.
Thank you very much. So my next question is tying like a few different threads of what's been said together. And I was thinking about this when Sam mentioned in the answer to the last question around the humility to admit when we get things wrong, as well as in the initial contribution as like we are now in the midst of a government that is allergic to scrutiny. So when I think back to a few years ago when I was at the National Union of Students and the Counterterrorism and Borders Bill was making its way through Parliament, many of us joined the call between sort of NGOs, advocacy organizations and others to call for an independent review into the prevent duty. And even as the National Union of Students, we signed on to that call, saying that, you know, as long as the terms of reference included the potential for the abolition of prevent. And I think at that time, there were few organizations such as CAGE and others saying that there's no point asking for an independent review. It's just going to be filled with a reviewer of the government's choice. And we're just going to see a sort of like a fresh curtains on the prevent duty in the same way as we've seen before in terms of the rhetoric it's couched in, be that the community cohesions of the late noughties, the integration of the early 2010s, and the move towards safeguarding from the Counterterrorism and Security Act. So since the announcement of the independent review, we saw Lord Carlisle initially appointed and then removed as the independent reviewer. And we now see the appointment of the ardent defender of Guantanamo Bay, former director of the Henry Jackson Society and former chair of the Charity Commission, under whose guise the Charity Commission went from a support organization to essentially a policing function of the state, cracking down on charities involved in international aid or campaigning, a trend that has continued to the current chair of the Charity Commission and will likely continue beyond that. Who has now been appointed as the independent reviewer of the prevent duty. How do you think we respond to that in terms of the current political moment? Yeah, I guess I'll put that out to anyone that wants to go for it. If not, I'll just, we'll go in the same order. Asad, have you unmuted because you want to go first, or? Oh, no. Sam, over to you.
Yeah, it's a really, really troubling appointment, and I think the response has to be a full-scale kind of boycott of the process. It's not an area that I've had lots of year. I haven't had years of experience working on prevent, but it does seem to me that's got to be rejected and boycotted, and the work done to kind of get as many organisations on board and showing solidarity with that is really important. I also wonder, if it is that opportunity to again, and I think connects to what some of Eda was saying about how we reject the framing and not just the kind of appointment of the review. I remember there was interesting stuff going around Twitter of like saying, oh, a white man appointed to that's not a good look, and it was like fundamentally missing the point of kind of why it was a particularly horrendous appointment. But I think where we can again situate that in the framing of kind of why it's not just an issue with who's been appointed, but reiterate why the entire kind of framing of prevent is problematic. That's an opportunity to do that, and hopefully it's an opportunity for organisations working in this area to coordinate and collaborate and use it as a launch pad.
Thanks, Eda.
Thanks, Ilyas, for that question. So there's no good review of the prevent duty because there's no good version of the prevent duty. And I'm not surprised that CAGE had that perspective from the start, because they've been involved in a lot of these reviews and have seen them to be essentially toothless ways of legitimizing things that we should be opposing outright. So you know, again, with this, I think boycotting the review process is definitely one way to delegitimize it. It's just the fact that we have had that happen before with kind of similar things, and it's a bit frustrating to always end up in a position of having demanded a review and then invariably ends up being ineffective, and then, you know, we go through the motions of pretending to hold the government to account. So it kind of comes back to my overall frustrations with a kind of liberal reformist approach, where we end up trying to repackage extremely bad legislation with some generic human rights language, some toothless oversight, and then deliver that as if it's a win. So yeah, I think it just has to be a renewed opposition to prevent. And I think more could be done to get more of the kind of centre left on board with that. So, you know, I think it was really disappointing that the Labour Party under Corbyn, although Corbyn did come out and say, you know, we need to end the war on terror, did not then come out and demand a repeal of the prevent duty. So I think we need to do more to kind of push the centre on this question. And I think one of the ways to do that, I think one of the ways that in the US, they've been very successful in pushing back on mass incarceration is to show its links to slavery. And we can do the same with counterterrorism. We can show that the tools of counterterrorism were pioneered in the colonies as methods to suppress uprisings against colonial rule. And so this is a system that we need to oppose in whole. Prevent is one manifestation of that system. And I think we can do that by looking, you know, making clear the past that is in the present, right? And that is the colonial past when it comes to counterterrorism. So that's what I would say on the prevent review.
Thank you so much, Eda. Asad, before we come to you, I just wanted to tie in a bit of a sort of further question and then come back to the other speakers as well, which was around so one of the things that Eda mentioned in her initial contribution, and I think that we're all very aware of, is that the process around sort of state surveillance and the erosion of our civil liberties has been not restricted to one political party. It's existed under decades in various different strains. So at the moment, we see ourselves with a front bench, which couldn't even bring itself to stand against the Spycops bill, despite being the party of trade unions. We see environmental campaigners specifically calling for the leader of the opposition to testify to the Spycops inquiry about his potential complicity. And we saw the most radical Labour Party manifesto in decades failing to even call for, you know, as was rightfully mentioned, even the repealing of the prevent duty. Do we now think that, and I guess this is coming towards like a bit of a more hopeful turn, hopefully, that with a section of the left which has now broken from parliamentary politics in a certain way, or do we think there's an opportunity there to allow them to envision beyond the usual manifestos and break with the logics of, you know, the carceral logics and the bordering logics that has so far defined much of their thinking? And tied to that, I guess, how do we, actually, do you know what? I'll end that one there before I go off on a mad one. Asad.
Well, some really good questions there, Ilyas. And it just reminds me a little bit of the, again, sorry, show my age, but you know, the debates we used to have between some sections of our movement, and we would argue, particularly around for policing and police accountability, when we were against the Police Complaints Authority, and then people were welcoming the Independent Police Complaints Authority. We were saying it's just the same, but it's just shinier and more. And what you've done, what it will do, it dissipates the energy about how do you hold the state accountable, and it fundamentally doesn't understand the question in all of these, whether it's reviews or where does our power lie and what power do we have versus the power of the institutions. And so any review where we're not powerful is by nature going to reproduce the very inquiry or the investigation that it set out. So for me, I would say we should be taking a step back and thinking, first of all, how do we rebuild our power? And that is not simply by looking at political parties and what they should do. And in fact, many of us argued vis-a-vis the previous Labour administration that it should be arguing for a positive agenda around rights. It shouldn't be looking simply at what reform it would do to these institutions, but use it as an opportunity to have a wider conversation around the relationship we have as individuals and communities to the state. What does it mean now to have democratic rights, and how could we refresh and re-win that sort of argument about the democratic mandate, right, which stretches all the way back to the charterists and suffragettes and trade unionists, etc., all through British history, this constant fight between people wanting to realize their rights and the state. And and that's what we've lost at this moment. And so I think the prevent conversation, I would take a step back and say there is a real need for a real positive conversation in this moment for us to have, to rebuild from a very local level this conversation. What is our rights agenda? How do we defend? What does it mean to have rights in this moment of new technology, of the 21st century and all of these, and then fight for that. And then have, as part of that, the insider advocacy to influence political parties, but to recognize it's the movement question which should come first, rather than the inquiry or the institution question. So I would turn it on its head. I don't know, and that's not quite an answer in terms of around and prevent. And I personally would always argued we should be abolishing prevent, not looking to reform it, because the very logic of what it was trying to do was something we should be opposing. And the state, is in all of these things, has its sufficient powers already to be able to deal with any criminal offences. And we argued this about why there was no need for additional racially aggravated offences, etc., because the state already had the power. It was a question about the state was not willing to use existing powers against forces that were threatening Black communities. And it was more a question of, again, brought back to, it was our power that was the most important thing, not whether the state had more tools. And too much we look to the state and say, if it only had these tools, it would act in this particular way. And again, it comes back to the state is not neutral in that engagement with us as citizens. So a renewed citizenship rights fight is what I think is really critical at this moment.
Great, thanks, Asad. Eda or Sam, whoever wants to go first. Let's go, Eda. We'll go in reverse this time.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add actually to the kind of sort of two kind of frames that I outlined before, in terms of making clearer the kind of economic and material basis of civil liberties, and reinvigorating that kind of opposition to neoliberalism and capitalism more broadly, and situating our opposition to assaults on our civil liberties in that framework. And the coming back to the framework that abolition gives us. And in terms of kind of concrete, like organizing, I think that we could do a lot more in, firstly, political education. I think kind of literacy around abolition in the UK is relatively low, and much lower than the kind of areas that Asad has been talking about, even though maybe the word abolition was not used, but that was essentially what we're talking about in terms of state neutrality and opposition to state power. So, the political education part, I think, is important, and also kind of getting people educated in everyday anti-fascism and everyday anti-policing. A lot of the best work happens just by communities resisting these things happening. And I think some more effort in terms of getting people to be more equipped to oppose policing when they see it, or to oppose policing of protests when they see it, that's, I think, really important. And we saw that with XR, who have many complaints about their attitude towards policing of protests, but there was a lack of real understanding of how police police protests and what we need to do to protect ourselves. You saw that across the board with a lot of the protesters at XR. So I think there's a political education aspect in a kind of ideology sense, but there's also education, how to oppose these things at the everyday level that I think we could be doing more of.
Right. Sam, did you want to add anything? Or?
Two very small things, and I think both things already touched on. One is situating the failures of the response to the pandemic in the systems that already exist, and that goes back to the point I made right at the beginning around the pandemic has not been a cause of a lot of these issues; it's just exacerbated them. We can think about that in prisons, in detention, hostile environment, failure to support home people and housing. These are systemic issues, and it's important that we support and tell those stories to show that that these things were avoidable, not just in terms of the response to the pandemic, but also in terms of the situation that we're in at the start of the pandemic. So that wider kind of explanation of those systems is really important. And then the second thing is just really to I loved what Asad was saying again in his introduction about organising and that coalition building and that real hard work and slog of building those connections and relationships, because that's the power that can be built between people that leads to real wins and change.
So I've just got one more question before we'll come to the audience one, and I'll try and keep this as brief as possible, but it's essentially around when we do this coalition building, we saw the beginnings of a coalition begin to form around the Spycops bill in September, when it reached the Houses of Commons, with trade unions joining many of the NGOs and MPs that have spoken around civil liberties and freedoms before. And I know, Asad, you mentioned sort of trade unions being part of sort of helping pack the gallery around the Macpherson inquiry, as well as historically there have been trade unions being part of multiple justice campaigns, as well as resisting incursions on our civil liberties. Yeah, I don't think it would be unforward of me to say that people could suggest that their engagement in the arena of civil liberties has often been slightly haphazard and unstrategic, in the sense of perhaps coming in where they see their members being impacted, as opposed to wholesale rejection around the logics of bordering, national security, and all of those things and counterterrorism and things when they come into play. How do you think we build this coalition, knowing that it will require actors like trade unions in order to bring them on board for the hard work that we have ahead of us?
I mean, the trade unions, when we look back at the history of the trade union movement or the labour movement, even around anti-racist organising, look, it's been checkered, right? And what changed it was largely black workers organising, or then reaching out, winning branch by branch, building up from the bottom, and of course having then a trade union leadership that saw this pressure coming from the inside of its own institutions, saying trade union movement should be mobilising on this anti-racist protest. It should be here, it should be there. And of course, speaking to their values as well, connecting to the labour movement values, and framing those fights in a way that was understandable to people. And of course, we can look back at Grunwick and say, the Grunwick strike was a pivotal moment, right, of how you reframed, black workers and migrant workers from being seen as being the people who drove down wages to becoming, this is the people who are championing trade union rights. So it is possible, but that's a hard slog. So, I don't want to do away, and the reality for most of us, right? Everybody, when you're faced with neoliberal onslaught that people have faced, the resist part seems to consume all of our time, right? Because we're constantly resisting in our each and every area. And so people just feel like we don't have energy to do the mobilize or the transform bit. But it's only when we get to the transform bit that we actually start to win on the resist bit. And I think that's been part of how progressive movements, I think, have just shrunk in their imagination. And you could say that's been the greatest victory of neoliberalism, right? That neoliberalism's victory was not in purely in what it is able to do, but the fact that it took away our ability to be able to imagine something different. And so everything becomes framed within, this is the frame in which we can operate, rather than here's a positive frame that and a vision of society which we should be striving for. But I do think, you know, and hats off to all the new movements, from the climate strikers to Black Lives Matter, who are clearly showing that there is a huge appetite for a positive agenda out there. So I think this is on all of us now, on our shoulders, to say, you know, what is the positive vision that we want to be able to fight for? And then how do we make sure that people who are coming into that coalition, you know, buy into that? And that again is, you know, the hard slog of winning from the bottom up. So, you know, in answer to the trade union movement, like all institutions, they're influenced by outside power and inside power. And if neither of those are there, then of course, you know, what do people expect? That the trade union movement is going to suddenly launch itself to do X and Y? It's not. That's just not the very nature of any institution. It's the same with NGOs, right? Look at the moment when NGOs have been the most engaged and active around broader frames, like around, for example, the WTO and Seattle protests. That was largely because you had powerful movements on the outside, social movements, who shifted the anchor of what was the terrain, and NGOs then followed. And I think this has been, you know, goes back to the point we think we all agree on. Too much has been about the insider advocacy and not enough about the building of power.
Just before, in case either of you want to come in, Eda or Sam, we've just had one question from the audience, which is, why does WikiLeaks and support the ending of Assange's political imprisonment fit into this conversation? So I'm not sure if either of you want to come in to answer either and or both of those questions.
I'm happy to just say that I think the campaign in support of Julian Assange being released and not being extradited to the US has actually been quite a good example of coalition building. I mean, there's been NGOs involved in it, there's been unions involved in it, and it has managed to actually garner the support of a lot of people. Unfortunately, it's such a high profile case, and you're up against an issue that is possibly the hardest issue, which is exposing war crimes, I mean, of the US state, of literally the US empire. So I think, although it's been a really great campaign, the result is not always given, even if you have quite an impressive alliance of people on an issue as intractable as US military protecting its interests, essentially. So that's just on that. And also, obviously, as a lot of people have said, the Assange case just shows how limited our liberties are to expose the state and to ensure transparency and accountability. Just on the point on unions, I think, as Asad said, I mean, it all comes down to actually joining unions and agitating within them. They are not necessarily natural allies in, you know, the fight for civil liberties, often because they are as susceptible to narratives of who is deserving of rights and who is not deserving of rights as anyone else. All I would say is that one potential angle is to look at issues of freedom of association, given that unions have been targeted by attacks on freedom of association, and those things are increasing, including all over the world. And I'm sure that they are looking at stuff happening in France and India and other places, and are very wary of similar things happening here. So that's just one particular angle.
Thanks, Eda. Sam, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I don't think I've got anything to add to those contributions.
In that case, I'm just going to quickly invite the speakers to, in no less than 60 seconds, give some suggestions that for the people that have attended this webinar, any like further reading, be that a book, be that an article, or a website, or a resource to redirect them to find out more, either about the work that you're doing on civil liberties or something that you've read that can help them think about civil liberties in this different way that we've been talking about today.
Shall I go?
Yes, Sam.
All right. I hope it's okay. But I'm going to say again to look out for the campaign that we're launching at the end of this month, which is all about a different way that we can respond to the pandemic with our rights intact. An alternative bill that gets rid of all the horrible things in the Coronavirus Act, but also crucially focuses on the support that people would need to keep everyone safe. So you can, if you follow Liberty on social, I think it's at Liberty HQ, you'll see that popping up towards the end of this month. And also I would follow our investigations team, who are producing good, really interesting and informative investigative journalism into the pandemic response, and you can follow that all on social media.
Thank you, Sam. Eda?
So I've put two things in the chat. One is a report from an abolitionist group in the US that goes into a good amount of detail on policing of the pandemic and public health alternatives. And the second is a report by Arun Kundani and a few others on progressive alternatives to the war on terror.
Thanks. Asad?
I was also going to suggest the TNI report. I think is very good, and Arun is a great, sort of a part of our movement and really done some amazing work in terms of thinking about this issue. I think there's a lot of amazing stuff out there. I mean, I think the importance of political education is really key. Do follow War on Want, and particularly and turning our political education into solidarity, and all around the world, this repressive policing and carceral approach is being used, and War on Want's trying to stand with as many of our frontline communities as possible. So do follow us. And maybe I'd say, if look back at some of the racing classes of the 80s and 90s, of the debates that happened around policing, and you could just change the date and they're as relevant today as they were then.
Just in Liam from Institute of Race Relations, do shout a big yes in the chat box. So thank you very much to all of our speakers for joining us today. It has been an absolutely phenomenal webinar, for me anyway. I've greatly enjoyed it. A reminder that you will be able to watch the webinar back on Abolitionist Futures website and on YouTube once we upload it. Just to let everyone know that this is the third webinar, but the final one of the series will be next Wednesday at the same time. So the final webinar will cover justice in many incarnations, including justice for workers, those in incarceration, and those participating in behavior which has been criminalized. It will also aim to recenter the importance of international justice, returning to the fore of our politics and abandoning patriotism, progressive or otherwise, in the pursuit of justice. The speakers next week are Dalia Gabriel from Navarro Media and co-author of Empire's Endgame, which will be out with Pluto Press later this month or early next month. I can't exactly remember, but you could check it out on Pluto Press. John from the Prisoner Solidarity Network, Imani Robinson from Talking Drugs, and Professor Lala Khalili from Queen Mary University London. Next week's session will be facilitated by Lola Olufemi, from whose book Feminism Interrupted the title of this webinar series is taken. So I look forward to hopefully seeing you all next week then. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you again to our speakers, and enjoy your dinner, everyone.